Hey guys, in this video I want to show you how you can mix drums using the Waves Signature Series plugins. Now, these plugins are pretty unique in the sense that they provide you kind of an unconventional way of mixing because I think for Waves they set out to make some plugins that took away a lot of the complicated nature of mixing and took a lot of the guesswork out of it. And just made some plugins where it's very easy to achieve some pretty good results without a lot of tweaking. So for some people, they'll like that in the sense that they don't need to know all the details about parameters and stuff of mixing. But some people won't like that because they don't like the lack of functionality or the lack of control. So I have to commend Waves for trying to come up with something unique and different. I think if you're trying to mix very quickly or just get a rough demo up, even if you're a very experienced mixer, these plugins have something to offer for you. If you're just getting started mixing, then I would definitely recommend these plugins because you don't have to worry about learning stuff. That you can just fire up these plugins, mess around a little bit with that. So I'll go ahead and get started showing off these plugins. I'm going to be using Pro Tools today. For my drum samples, I'm going to be using BFD2. That's a great drum library from FXpansion. So here's my edit window. I have my drum performances. This first one right here is just a kind of a long drum performance, a groove, so you can hear it. This one is kind of like a fill over here. You'll hear it later on. It's got some toms. It's kind of more like a chorus section, so you can hear the different parts. I'll be switching between them just for to show off the different plugins. Let me switch over now to the mix window. So I have an instrument track here with BFD2 loaded up. Then I have in BFD2 I have all the instrument tracks getting bussed out to their respective auxiliary inputs in Pro Tools. So these are auxiliary tracks, and I've got them loaded up and named based on their instruments. And I have all these, if you look at the kick, all the way over to the ambient channels. I have them going to this bus right here. I have an L1 limiter going onto the bus just to kind of make sure that the level between them is somewhat similar, a little bit limited, so I'm not clipping or anything like that going to the video. I've got my master bus, the video out, and I have my microphone going to the video as well. So before I get into showing you the plugins, let me show you how I've got everything set up in BFD2. So I've got a very basic kit loaded up, a kick, a snare, hi-hat, some 3 toms, 2 crashes, a left crash, a right crash, my ride cymbal. I'll show you each of these because in BFD2, what's cool is you can control the different level of microphones. So there are direct mics. That's like the kick in and the kick out for the bass drum. But then you also have control over how much of the kick is going through the overhead, the room, and the ambient microphones. So I typically don't like a whole lot of kick in the room. I want there to be a little bit so that it sounds realistic, but I don't want there to be a whole lot. So what I've done is backed off the kick a little bit in each of the microphones. For the snare, I usually like the snare to sound big and in a room, so I've got those still up. The hi-hat I've pulled back a little bit too. The toms are up. The ride, the crashes are down a little bit. So that's really that. I'm going to be loading up some different kit pieces later on too, so you can hear, how different kind of drums sound with the Wave Signature Series plugins too. I loaded up a groove, and I just basically dragged and dropped the groove over into my Pro Tools session for each of those. So that's, I'm using the grooves from the BFD library, BFD2 library. And then in the mixer, here are the individual channels. What I've done is used the sends from from BFD2 to go directly out to Pro Tools. So when you load up, originally all the channels are, when you load it up, all the channels are going to the master. However, when you do that, in that case, all the channels will come out here onto your instrument track through the master, and you don't have individual control over each of them. Now what I'd like to do is mix the kick drum, the snare, all individually, using compressors, equalization, and stuff like that. So that's why I've got the kick going to different output channels, and you can see them here, all the way through the ambient. And these are stereo outs now over here instead of mono for the other ones. Then what you do in Pro Tools is on your auxiliary tracks, or you can do this with instrument tracks as well, is you click on the input and you have interface, bus, and plugin. You just select, for this one, it's the mono 1, and that's over here, mono 1. So that's how you can bus out the individual tracks to Pro Tools to mix them separately using BFD2. So that's cool. I've brought down the levels a little bit to make sure I'm not clipping on each of these. The hi-hat I brought down. Now just so you know, these are also, so there's an overhead send, but then there are also direct mics for the cymbals. So that's kind of cool that BFD has that. Some of the other drum libraries don't offer you in the same way that you have like a single direct microphone on top of like a tom or a snare. BFD has direct mics for the hi-hat and each of the cymbals as well. So that's cool, but I actually don't use a whole lot of it. I just mix in a little bit of the direct mics to kind of add a little bit more directionality to the stereo field when the drum or when the cymbals are being hit. Same with the hi-hat. So what I've done with the crash cymbals in the ride is map those out to stereo 4. That's the same channel as the overhead, and I'm just mixing those together. I figure for the Wave Signature Series plugins, they're probably going to mix cymbals and the overhead mics very similar, so I've got those all going to the same thing. For the hi-hat, some of the Signature Series plugins have separate mixing for hi-hat, some of them don't. So I have the hi-hat going out to a separate channel, and you'll see later on for the Signature Series plugins that have specific hi-hat mixing, I'm using that. Otherwise, I'm just using the overhead mixing. So that's really how I've got it set up. These are the different levels for the room and the ambient. So the room is kind of a closer sound of room mics, and the ambience is the mics are placed very far from the drums and have much longer sustain. You'll hear that different later on when I'm showing you the different microphones. So that's really all I've done with BFD2 to get it set up with the groove. Let me play you back. I've my first groove. Let me make sure I've got that fired up. Edit window. Yep. So here's the first long groove. I'm going to play it back, and you can hear this is unprocessed. The unprocessed drum performance without using any of the plugins. Alright, I'm going to show you this is my other section as well. It has some toms in it, so I've got that so you can hear the unprocessed toms. Alright, and here's kind of the chorus section with more of the ride cymbal. Alright, so let's get the Signature Series plugins going so you can hear how they sound. Switch back over to the mix window. So the first one I've loaded up is the CLA plugins. This is the Chris Lord-Alge series bundles. Series plugins that come in his bundle, or some of them you can purchase separately in like the drums package and stuff like that. So what I've done with these is just on the individual instruments, I've called up the appropriate setting here. So in his drum series, you have individual instruments over here that you can assign, and really what that does is it puts on a predetermined EQ curve. So when you bring up the kick one right away, even if you bypass all the other settings, you can hear that the plugin's doing some things to shape the frequency response of the signal. And it does it a little bit different for the snare, the toms, the overhead room, and actually this cowbell setting right here. What's cool about it is it doesn't put an EQ curve on the signal. So even though it's called cowbell, you might think, oh, I'm only going to use this for something like percussion. I actually think that it's great because sometimes when I'm using these plugins, on a kick drum or something like that, I want to use the compressor and the reverb and stuff like that, but I don't want to use his EQ curve. I want to put on my own EQ curve either before the plugin or after the plugin or something like that. So what I'll do is just bring up the cowbell setting on the kick instead of using this setting. Then he has some general equalization channels that what you do is you kind of raise in some very smooth low frequency EQ curves. So there's like a super low one with the sub, there's a lower one and an upper one. Then there's a higher EQ bump that you can do with he calls them bite top roof, where you can bypass that by clicking them off like this, or you can select them like that. So that's the functionality of those. Then there's his compressor that he's using. He has 3 different types. He calls them push, spank, and wall. Wall is kind of like a limiter. These other ones are different kinds of compression. What you do is you kind of mix in more or less compression using this slider or this fader. What I've actually done is then he has reverb as well. I've taken the reverb off on all the channels. So you do that just by clicking this arrow and switching between them. So there are 3 different ones. A studio, that's kind of a smaller sound. A club, it's different sort of reverb tail to it, and a hall one, which is longer. And then there's a gate. I've bypassed the gate as well. I'll show these to you later on so you can hear what these features are doing. But for now, let me just play it back, switch between turning the plugins on and off so you can hear how they sound. But you can see basically what I've done is I've brought up the plugin, turned off the reverb and gate, left these settings how they are defaulted right out of the box. You don't have to worry about mixing them at all. Just selected the snares. Now he doesn't have the snare bottom and top mic mixed differently, even though I've got them coming out of BFD2 separately. I'm just using the snare for that. Then I've got toms. Hi-hat, I'm just using the overhead. Overhead, I'm using overhead. And room and ambience are both using room and ambience like that. Now, one thing you have to watch a little bit is this input sensitivity. How this works is it turns up or down your signal coming into the processing. So this is before you do any processing on it. This is important when you're doing any kinds of dynamics processing like compression or gate. You want that input level to be at a particular level, because that's going to impact how the compressor is working or how the gate's working. And so they have this meter right here that you don't want your signal to be too hot, that it's going to kind of oversaturate the compressor. It's going to cause this compressor to be working too hard on your signal, more than Chris Lord-Alge had desired when he kind of set up the plugins. Where you don't want to come in too quiet, so the compressor's not really kicking in and working, and your signal's below probably the threshold of the compressor. So you want to sit it right in the middle. The meter right here changes color from basically clear to green to yellow to red, or I guess there's an orange kind of in the middle too. There's nothing to say that you can't bring in your signal below the threshold of the compressor, or drive it really, really hard to achieve a sound. That's just they have it set up so you can use the input signal to kind of find the range where Chris Lord-Alge desired the compressors to be working in the gate and stuff. And you have your output fader over here just to make sure you're not clipping or anything like that, and control the level at the output. So let me play these back now, and you can hear. I'll switch bypass, and you can hear how they sound. So hopefully you could hear that these plugins, it's a pretty dramatic difference that it makes, and I think it does, make your drums sound better. The drums from BFD2, they're very realistic sounding drums. You can get a very realistic sounding drum performance using them. If you have a decent sequence going in Pro Tools, I think that they sound great. However, they need a little bit something extra to make them sit in a mix. And these mixing this way using the Signature Series plugins, it's very quick. It didn't take me a whole lot of time. I just dialed up the plugins, turned off a couple settings, and then that was it. It already improved the sound dramatically. So we'll come back and look more in detail on these plugins, but I'm going to move on to the Jack Joseph Puig Signature Series plugins. So there's a similar sort of thing. In his plugins, he has this input dial instead of a fader. It gives you the same kind of color readout, just to watch your dynamics. He has his compressor and gate over here as dials. I have just basically loaded up the plugins. Haven't really messed around with any of the settings. Made sure that my input was in the right color and the output wasn't clipping. Set him up. He has what's a little bit different. He doesn't have just kick and snare. He has kick in, kick out, snare top, snare bottom. So that's nice, that I can can select those individual ones. They're doing different things for each of the instruments. So that's nice that I can, for snare top, I've got those on each of the snare top mics, and then snare bottom over here and toms. Then all these faders that you see here, the attack, sustain, punch, tone, and verb, these are kind of parallel signals that are being processed, that are running in parallel with this main one. So this is the one that's kind of the straight signal. It has some processing like compressors and gates on it, but then like he mixes in, I guess, these other ones. So one that has a lot of attack to the signal. So he's probably rolled off a lot of the sustain in the signal and boosted up the attack. And then he has one probably where he's brought down the attack and brought up the sustain. And you can kind of mix these in for the instruments, how he would like them, fade between them. I guess for the toms, he doesn't have an attitude one, whatever that means, but for the snare, he does. I'll show you these later on. He's got, for snare, he's got a wood one and a presence. For kick drum, he's got punch and sub and attitude. So that's just the difference. Each of them is a little bit specific. So he's got a verb over here and tone and punch for the toms. To me, the JJP signature series is the most flexible because of this. You have a lot more control. In the other ones, you just have kind of a lot of the processing going on behind the scenes. But by having all these parallel channels that you can mix together, you can control the sound a lot more. And so, whereas I think like the CLA signature series, what's great about it is it does all that processing behind the scenes. So if you're not very experienced, or you just want to bring up, get a quick demo going, maybe for a client or something like that, that you don't have the time to go in and mix specifically, adjust compressor settings and stuff like that, you can bring up the CLA ones. With the JJP signature series, it's a very unconventional way of mixing. However, you can actually achieve a lot of different sounds because of there's actually a lot of control. It's just a different kind of control compared to a normal EQ or a normal compressor or something like that. Or because he's got all that stuff, maybe like a transient designer going on each of these channels, that you can mix in more of the how you would describe the sound. So you're using a snare drum or a toms or something like that, and you're like, you know what, I really just want some more attack of the snare. You don't have to worry about settings or anything like that. You just bring up the attack, you just bring up the sustain. So there's actually a lot of control with the JJP signature series compared to some of the other ones. So that's cool if you're looking for more control, but you don't want to have to worry about a lot of settings and stuff like that. Maybe the JJP is the one that you're looking for. So let me play these back and you can hear them. I guess I should go into the cymbals, and he's got a hi-hat channel, and he's got overhead room channels, but then he also has some percussion ones. So that's kind of cool. He's got tambourine, shaker settings. Each of these things do a little something different. Loops for maybe some program drum loops. So that's pretty cool. And you have the same kind of thing here. You're mixing in like some ambience, and you're setting your input level here. One thing I'll say that's a little bit frustrating that I wish Waves would have done is the amount of delay in each of these plugins is pretty high, and actually, for whatever reason, the JJP drums and the JJP cymbals and percussion have a different amount of samples delay. So if you're not really familiar with the processing inside of Pro Tools, some plugins will add a specific number of sample delays to the signal that's coming in, and it needs to do that delay to do the processing. Other plugins, it doesn't have to. It just can do it in essentially real time. So one thing that's frustrating is the JJP drums and the JJP cymbals and percussion add a different number of samples. So you have to add in, if you want to make them time aligned, you have to add in a a time adjuster. Now, for most people, I'm running Pro Tools 8. Most people that are running, Pro Tools 9 or Pro Tools 10 or almost every other DAW don't have to really worry about this now because they have automatic delay compensation. So any differences between the plugins will be automatically adjusted. That doesn't happen in Pro Tools 8. So if you're using Pro Tools 8 or something, just make sure that you are aware of that, because you wouldn't really want your overheads and rooms to come in 65 samples sooner than your drums. That will kind of screw it up. You might have phasing issues and stuff like that. So just that's one thing to watch for. Most people won't have to worry about it too much now if you have ADC turned on your DAW. But it's something to be aware of. And because of that, also I wouldn't recommend in general using these plugins while you're tracking, because there is a significant amount of delay. I've got all of them loaded up and I'm over 1,000 samples of delay. Each of them are a little bit different. CLA is around 100. The JJP is larger number of samples. Kramer's, around 100 too. So let me play this back and you can hear them. Alright, so that's the JJP. Let's move on to Eddie Kramer. Same sort of thing with his. There are some similarities. He's got the sensitivity. This is the input level control, where you see a meter, a color meter that tells you what level to do. He's got compressor. He's got a gate on it, treble, bass, and output. I've loaded his up here in my session, and then basically dialed in the sensitivity, made sure I wasn't clipping, and that was really it. And made sure that each individual channel, bass drum, both in and out, I have bass drum here, then snare, and I've got the other ones respectively selected appropriately, and then I've got hi-hat, he's got hi-hat to use that the other ones don't necessarily have, like the CLA. So I'll play these back, and you can hear what his plugins are doing, basically initialized right out of the gate. So hopefully they give you guys an opportunity to hear the Eddie Kramer ones. Now let's check out the Tony Maserati signature series. All right, so each of them has their own very unique user interface. They're all pretty cool. The Tony Maserati one is very unique, but they're all pretty cool. I like that Waves spent the time to not only make some pretty cool sounding plugins, but also ones that look pretty cool. So these are your options with the Tony Maserati plugins. You have bass drum, and I use that for both the kick in and out, and snare top, bottom, hi-hat, toms, overhead, and room. Just like the other ones, I basically went in, adjusted my input sensitivity to be in the correct range, brought down the output to make sure I wasn't clipping, left the other settings the same, made sure this is I have the appropriate setting for each of my kit pieces, and then I'll play it back. So that was the Maserati drum plugins. One thing that's also unique about the Maserati bundle, if you purchase that, is the Maserati group plugin. So let me bring that up. So the group plugin, this is separate. This is a whole separate plugin than the drum plugin, and these are used for different things. Instead of having like kick drum, snare drum, settings like that, what you have is these. It's kind of like a bus channel processing. So you have drums live. That's more for like acoustic drums. You have drums programming more for probably like synthetic drums, like an 808 or something like that. Tony Maserati's known for doing a lot of different styles of music, including some more urban, hip-hop, rap kind of stuff, as well as the acoustic kind of stuff like Jason Mraz. So then you have like kind of bus processing for guitar, strings, keys, background vocals, and then a masters one. So none of the other the Signature Series plugins have this specific bus processing plugin. So I think that's cool that Tony Maserati included that as part of his thing. That's very unique compared to the other ones. So if you're looking for this kind of you want this as kind of like an added bonus to the different bundles, then maybe checking out the Tony Maserati one is cool. So what I've done, let me bypass the limiter. Instead of using the L1, I'll just use the drums live setting as my bus processor. I've brought up the sensitivity, left everything else basically the same. So I'll switch this on and off, and you can hear how it sounds, and kind of bring in the L1 too, so you can hear the difference. To my ears, I hear that there's some kind of compression limiting going on. Also, I think that he's adding some kind of subtle reverb to the drums to kind of make everything sound like it's being played together. So that's really it. I'll play it back and you can hear it. So that's really the Tony Maserati plugins. This one's cool. I can hear that it's also, has some EQ that's doing, even though I've set these still at 0, it's kind of thickening things up for the drums live. Later on, I'll show you the different ones, maybe the master one in the drums program, so you can hear how they, different these kind of settings sound. So now what I'll do is kind of show you all the different Signature Series plugins, right, one after the other. So you can hear, okay, what's CLA doing compared to JJP, compared to Eddie Kramer, compared to Maserati. And I'll just play it out for a while, and you can hear the differences. Here we go. I'm also going to load up some different kit pieces so you can hear how these plugins work with different kinds of drums. So I'll play them back and maybe bring in a different kind of kick drum, load that up, different snare, different hi-hat. Wait for these to load. So hopefully you got to hear, these plugins. I'm just using them straight out of, basically straight out of the box. How they're initialized, not doing any tweaking to them, and you can hear right away that they have a dramatic effect on the drums that I'm using. So if you don't want to have to spend the time to figure out how do I want to compress this, how do I want to EQ it, you can just use these plugins and get pretty dramatic results right away. So this is, I've got these new kit pieces loaded up. All right, maybe one more set of different sounding drums, something that's very unique. Different hi-hat. All right, so those, while they're loading, one thing I think that's great is, I've got these plugins, but I don't really necessarily use them on every single song that I ever do. For someone that is maybe has experience mixing a lot of rock music, maybe you don't have a lot of experience mixing the kind of urban hip-hop kind of sounds. So let's say you have a client come in and say, hey, I want to do this kind of song. You can either, try your best with whatever plugins you've got using the techniques that you've practiced a lot for rock mixes. Or you could just say, you know what, I'm just going to bring up the Tony Maserati ones, and he's basically got his plugin set up that they're going to sound good for that style of music. So I'll just use what he's got and just say, I'm more familiar mixing with specific kinds of music. So in that case, I'll use the ones for that are very specific to that kind of sound. Same with like someone that's, let's say you're experienced with like more modern kind of rock sounds, but you don't have a lot of experience, and you have a client that comes in going for a really retro kind of vintage sound of rock, then maybe the Eddie Kramer ones appropriate for you to use instead of going through the hassle of trying to get that vintage kind of sound using, if you've got whatever kind of EQs and compressors you use for whatever, the modern kind of rock that you're used to, or vice versa. I feel like the CLA drums package is really good for that very modern kind of rock sound. He does a lot of work with the big bands like Green Day and stuff like that that have very specific kind of modern drum sounds. So, if you're interested in that, maybe you should, if you're less experienced in that kind of sound, achieving the modern rock kind of results using your own compressors and EQs, then maybe checking out his bundle is a good way to complement the plugins you've already got. So here's the last set of drums in that I'll show you. The unprocessed versions. I know it's all kind of subjective as far as preferences go for different sounds. However, I think, especially with that last combination of drums, the kind of the beefy low-end snare drum, kind of the woody sounding snare, some of the signature plugins sounded better than others on it. And so that's just something to be aware of. Even though these plugins are meant to be kind of for general use kind of EQs and stuff like that, they're not always going to work with every single drum. And then if you're using it for other instruments like guitars as well, there's plugins, they'll work great in some cases, but in other cases they won't. So it's something to experiment with and try out. So what I like to do now is I'll go back to my original basic kit that I've got loaded up. with the DW snare. Let those load. Now what I want to do is show you more of the flexibility of the individual plugins by showing you the channels. So let me bypass these. I'll start out with the CLA, and I'll go through, start with the kick, and then show you more of the controls and the different sounds that you can get with it. So here we go. Full mix. Now I'll solo this and we'll just start working on the kick drum. So that will hit by bringing up the level, it hits the compressor different than when it's quieter. You want to set it right about in the yellow-orange range. Then I'll play around with the different settings too. More low end, taking the low end out. This is a reverb. That's a kick in, kick out. Same sort of thing. I'll go quicker through this one. So while I'm here, I want to show you the cowbell setting because it's the one that lacks a EQ curve. So you can hear, kind of determine by listening the difference between what kind of EQ curve is going on the kick versus no EQ curve. All right, snare. Same thing here with the cowbell. No EQ curve, snare EQ curve. I'll just jump over to the snare bottom. Alright, now I'll just go to the hi-hat. Now this is just what I'm doing. He doesn't have a hi-hat setting, so it's just the overhead. You can hear what the EQ curves kind of... So, for the overhead versus like the kick drum, different EQ curves, different kind of sub, different kind of lower. Overhead. So you can control, a fair amount by using a different EQ. If you want to pull something out or boost it, you can do the general sorts of EQ manipulations that you would need to. It's just kind of like the fine detail. Let's say you want to subtract out some particular frequency that didn't sound good. You couldn't really do that with these plugins, but the general sorts of stuff, boosting top end, pulling out top end, you can do all those things. Alright, finally some room. Really squashing that room. So that's the CLA. I'm going to show you the JJP now individually. There's the in. Gate it, compress it. It's generally Q curves. And what do these attack and sustain do? bring a lot more attack in. Gotta watch output. Punch. Sub. And what you can do also is kind of pull these in and out. You don't have to necessarily bring them up or down and fade them in. You can just take them out completely. Bring them back in. So here's what it's this back about normal. Alright. Switch over to the next one. Same sort of thing. And maybe for the output or the out mic, you want to bring up the sub a little bit. Here with the bottom mic, one's a little bit different. Bring up some reverb. Hi-hat. So here's what he's got going on. Nothing too fancy. Overheads. And ring. Ambience. You just gotta watch the output if you're gonna bring up some of these things in parallel. So that's the JJP, Eddie Kramer, in mic, compressor. Better bypass, unbypass. Gate. Treble. He has this effects up here too. Some kind of parallel mix, I think, of some kind of reverb, but also compression and stuff going on. So like on this one, it doesn't have the gate. Hi-hat, overheads. Room. Finally to Tony Maserati individual channels. So I'll show you this bypassed, so you can hear what it's doing. On the Tony Maserati drum plugins, you'll notice there's not a compressor setting. There's really just some EQ kind of settings. I guess the snap one probably is a combination of like mid to high EQ with probably some more compression added into it. So you really have to watch the sensitivity if you want to compress it less or compress it more, and then adjust the output. So you don't have that same level of flexibility of bringing up and down a fader or a knob or something as the other ones, but you can still compress things more or less by using the sensitivity. So, you know, even within the different plugins, there's different levels of control that some people will like or not like. You know, compare the Maserati with just 5 knobs to the JJP that had all kinds of different faders, different knobs. You know, there's different levels of control, different sounds. Hopefully that there's something for everyone, I think is what Waves was shooting for. Here's the snare bottom one now. Hi-hat. Nothing too fancy. overheads. So I'll just, as an example, I'll show you like you can compress things more by adjusting the sensitivity and the output, or less by doing the opposite. Less compression, more compression. Really compressed, uncompressed. Finally, I'll play this back, bypass that limiter, bring up this one so you can hear what this is doing. Group bus plugin again. You know, even though I'm using acoustic drums here, there's nothing to say that I can't use a drum programs one. It doesn't have, it's less subtle to me. It still has some kind of limiter. I can tell by what it's doing to the output peak. But it doesn't seem to be adding in that ambience as well. And it doesn't have the dramatic boost in the low end. Master, so this would be like, you could use this for your whole mix, or you could just use it for your drums. So hopefully you guys got to hear and see some of the differences between the Signature Series plugins. You got an idea about how you can mix drums kind of unconventionally using these kinds of plugins rather than a normal compressor and a normal EQ and those sorts of processors. That these are very unique and they try to aim to be very user-friendly in the sense that you don't have to worry about a lot of parameters, a lot of attack release settings, and how wide is my Q on my equalizer. Do I boost 3 dB? Do I cut 6 dB? It's really supposed to be based about listening to it. Don't worry about the settings. Listen to what sounds good. If it sounds good, use it. If it doesn't sound good, pull up something else and try it out. These plugins aren't going to sound perfect for every single song, for every single instrument, but hopefully you find some things where they fit well together. you know, if it's different styles of music, I think that the different producers that they picked, Chris Lord-Alge kind of has that very modern rock kind of sound. Jack Joseph Puig, some of that rock kind of stuff, but also a little bit more pop, sits in that range. Tony Maserati, you know, pop kind of stuff from Jason Mraz that's very acoustic driven, all the way to some more hip hop kind of sounds. Um, and then the Eddie Kramer with that very vintage retro kind of rock. In each of the producers, I think, kind of put that signature sound into their plugins. You know, it's not to say that you don't want to get your own signature sound and develop your own way of mixing, but these kind of plugins, I think, capture the essence of these different styles of music that you can just use. You know, I'm just using BFD2 and as my drum sampler. And with these plugins, you know, I can mix and match kit pieces and come up with some very realistic sounding drum performances that also sit really well in my mix by using these plugins. Didn't take a whole lot of work, although there's a little bit of flexibility if you need it with these plugins. You just have to experiment and try it out, and hopefully, you know, it's a way of thinking outside the box for mixing compared to how you would normally have to pull up a plugin and maybe you have your favorite settings that you use for EQs and compressors, but it's not the same when you're just pulling up one of these plugins, clicking, you know, kick for the kick drum, and right away you've got a good sounding EQ curve and compressors going on. So hopefully people enjoyed the video, got to see some things. If you haven't used the plugins before, you can always demo stuff from Waves off their website, so I'd encourage you to check that out. See if it's for you. Maybe it's not for you. That's all right. Check out some of my other videos if you want some more in-depth tutorials on how you would do things like compress and EQ, similar to what these guys have going on behind the scenes of their Signature Series plugins. So check back more. I'll have some more videos up with drums and maybe other instruments coming up in the future too. Take care, guys.